Hi, it's Seth from Pages and Panels, and I am so excited today to be talking with Jeff Trexler from the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, a very important organization. Jeff Trexler has served since 2020 as Interim Director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting free expression and the legal rights of the comics community. He has extensive experience in providing strategic advice to librarians, teachers, retailers, publishers, creators, legislators, and even law enforcement on responding to attempts to restrict access to graphic novels. An attorney himself, he is also the first Comic Book Legal Defense Fund director since its founding in 1986 to provide direct legal representation in censorship cases, most notably the successful defense of Genderqueer against an unconstitutional attempt to prohibit the book's sale or distribution in Virginia. Prior to joining the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, Jeff served for a decade as Associate Director of the Fashion Law Institute, held a chair professorship in social entrepreneurship, was a member of the board of directors of the Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art. He holds a JD from Yale School of Law, a PhD from Duke University, and he is admitted to practice before the US Supreme Court and in New York. Jeff, that is an incredibly impressive bio. How do you have time for reading comics with all of that?
That's a good question. Comics have just been part of my life. I think the more responsibility I get, the more my books that are written solely in text get sacrificed. So a lot of what I read is actually graphic novels, manga, old school comics. I guess they call them floppies now. But they really are my lifeblood.
Well, I love that. Well, thank you for taking time to talk with me today. Let's kind of get into that lifeblood. Let's talk about your comic book fandom. Where did it start? What compelled you to get involved with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund? So it's an important organization, obviously.
Thanks, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. It's one of the things that I wanted to do after a life in reading comics since my early childhood was think about what I could do to give back to the comics community, and helping the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund has been an incredibly rewarding part of that. I can't remember a time without comics for me. I mean, literally, I remember when I was a little kid, there was a master's thesis, somebody was writing a master's thesis, and they interviewed me for this thesis. They were talking about how I learned to read, because I had this really weird view of reading, which was that text and images were fused. They were one, and in a way, a text could serve as an image. And what I credited that to when I was a little kid was seeing the TV show Batman in the original run, not to date me, but back in the 1960s, and they would show the Bat logo with the word Batman in it and sing the word Batman. And I just remember this epiphany. It's like that is those words. That is altogether that word and picture. And I became obsessed with comics. And I'm very fortunate to have parents who were extremely indulgent in my love for comics. They got me Jules Pfeiffer, the great comic book heroes. They got me the Batman, Superman, from the 30s to the 70s. Bought me basically anything I wanted in comics. They wanted to encourage reading. And it wasn't long before reading about comics back then, you discovered that they had this rich history from Pfeiffer and the 30s to 70s books, but also 100-page giants. And I started encountering law. I loved law. I read about the Shazam, DC or national, fight over Captain Marvel and Superman. I subscribed to the Buyer's Comics, the Buyer's Guide for Comics Fandom, and read about the whole Jerry Siegel, Schuster, DC situation as it unfolded in the 1970s. I was just fascinated with this because it raised some fundamental questions about creativity, about literacy, about ethics. And then I ended up, which got me reading also about the whole comics code and that kind of thing. Because I love Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and there was some questions about the comics code and drugs. And so I started diving into that and history, which is what led me to go to a college library and read Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent when I was a kid, which got me thinking about these questions a long time ago. So for me, it's like I said, it's been something I've been interested in. It's been something I've been studying. And these cases started arising we're all familiar with what happened in the 1950s in the Great Comic Book Scare and the laws that were passed against comics, comics that were thrown on bonfires, Senate hearings about comics. New York State, had hearings on comics. It was a big, big issue that I delved into a lot of that history. And then I saw it revived in the 1980s and witnessed the formation of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. What struck me then, and almost 40 years later still does, as an incredibly important organization to help protect the comic arts. And we can talk about why comics are under threat and why these arrests started happening. But it was fascinating to watch. And then when I became a lawyer, I started offering to help. So this really is this really is in many ways my life. Comics are an amazing medium. They are, as I like to say, the literacy, their 21st century literacy, the foundation of 21st century literacy. That's what makes them so important. And I think that's what also makes them so scary to a lot of people.
It's interesting how the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund kind of acts as this, protector of comics, this whole medium that revolves around superhero, or at least initially starts with the whole premise of superheroes and, protecting those. And so part of that protecting of free speech in the comic book community, it is important, but can you talk about why it's so critical and why readers or anyone listening to this should really care about, the protection of that free speech, especially when it comes to comics?
Comics, we talk a lot about, there's a lot of attention now being paid to the history of comics and how comics in some ways can be traced back millennia. I mean, we've had cave paintings. If you ever go to Egypt, there's this wonderful tomb of tea where you walk inside of a tomb and the whole wall is covered in these images of Egyptian life. I mean, comics have a long, rich history going back to tapestries in the 19th century. But what happens in the 20th century is we have this fundamental shift. As literacy became democratized, sort of evolving straight up outside of a priestly or educated class to something that everybody could have and everybody could have access to books. In the 20th century, we have images in a way, communication through images democratized. It becomes much easier to do. It becomes much less expensive to reproduce and to distribute. And in the 1930s, we had this explosion of comics on newsstands everywhere, which were a bounty for many reasons for the general public. One of which people talked about at the time is a way to make a lot of money. Comics were easy to do, in many ways easier to do than writing a novel. Everybody felt they could write a picture, tell a short story, and get that out in it for a dime. It was easily readable. It was, as Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist, said, a participatory medium. People read it, they wanted to draw it, they could build careers on it, they could build fandoms on it. It was this amazing thing. But it was also a new way of communication. You had several hundred years since Gutenberg of communication primarily through text. You had the Enlightenment, the notion that text was somehow more trustworthy, more credible, that pictures were deceptive and childish to the extent they were useful at all. And comics change it. Comics are now everywhere, and people became afraid. Making it even more afraid, comics are information dense. Something that you could take 3 pages to describe in a novel made out of text, you can show in a panel in comics. And there's this tremendous sense in the comics that anything is possible. It's in a way you can't do in text. You can always draw outside the lines. Which is why in the early, say, Batman comics, it very quickly goes from early detective comics from just straight panels like you would see it reproduced from a newspaper to Batman going throughout the page and cutting across multiple panels. Comics in some ways defy the law, right? So it wasn't long before people became afraid of comics. They saw them as a threat to literacy. They saw them as a threat to public order, a threat to morality. They saw them as particularly for children, since people, for historical reasons we won't necessarily get into in any depth, saw associated pictures with kids and comic storytelling with kids. It was like the Captain Crunch that you ate until you graduated to steak, right? So you ate the little the kid stuff until you got to the real food. So they were concerned. They were concerned that you had these books everywhere. Kids weren't going to learn. Uh, Kids weren't going to be able to read. And then kids were going to feel like anything was possible, that the old ways were gone. And that's what a lot of what Wortham writes about. Wortham was a progressive in the 1950s. Back when I was in law school, when he was studied, it wasn't about comics. It was about the role he played in Brown against Board education, the desegregation of American schools, and arguing for doing research that was the basis of the desegregation of American schools. So he was a hero. He was a progressive hero for many people. And he sees this threat to literacy, this threat to kids, this as a real he sees it as a public health problem. So we had the forces of sort of adulthood, legislators, courts, police, teachers, everybody arrayed with one goal in mind, and that was to stamp out comic books. We managed to defeat it through a little bit of a clever ruse, I guess. We adopted self-regulation as an industry, saying that we weren't going to use certain words, we weren't going to show certain images, stories weren't going to have this boundless capability. Law and order would always win in the stories, and they weren't going to show overt sexuality, which had a number of problems in terms of censorship and the ability of people to communicate, make a living through comics. And so when it started happening again in the 1980s, people saw this threat coming back. We had this explosion of independent voices in comics, and now people were looking, specifically targeting independent, sort of non-Marvel and DC books, and saying that they were illegal, they were obscene, and they should be out. We had comic shops going out of newsstands and going everywhere throughout the community and just showing all kinds of books from all sorts of publishers. And people were targeting comic shops and saying that they were purveyors of obscenity. And a lot of people were wondering whether they could even continue to stay in business. And again, threat to distribution, which has knock-on effects in terms of threats to people feeling free that they could publish again. We finally settled down in the 2000s and think, well, okay, we comics were getting used to it, manga were getting used to it, until really it around 1920 or 2020, 2021, and the pandemic. Kids start seeing parents reading books, graphic novels in school on Zoom, just like we're talking now, and it starts exploding again. Graphic novels are subliterate. Graphic novels are a threat to our children. You can't read a graphic novel and pass a standardized test. You won't be able to read. You won't be able to talk. You won't be able to express yourself. And kids are learning all sorts of bad things in graphic novels. And once again, like Wortham said, graphic novels were a threat to public health and mental health. We now have the revival that graphic novels are our problem. They warp kids' minds in terms of their own mental health, and they encourage depression, self-harm, social maladjustment. I mean, these are arguments I literally had to argue against in court in Virginia just 2 years ago, with citations too on the other side. Citation to scholarship from the 1940s and 50s, produced in conjunction with the Great Comic Book Scare. It is back, and it is a problem. And just as comics have reached an unprecedented height, going from the newsstands to comic book shops to being part of our schools and libraries, so the opposition to comics has intensified.
So you mentioned the Virginia case. What other landmark cases have you all had throughout the tenure of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund?
Mm-hmm. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund as you mentioned in the beginning, was founded in the mid-1980s. There's this impression that what we do in the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, because we have been working for decades to protect people in court cases or give advice on how to keep your books from being removed from store shelves or being removed from library shelves or kept out of schools. There's this impression that this is a bunch of fundamentalist Christians from the South who are fighting. Now you look at the history of it. Some of the most intense battlegrounds in the war on comics in the 1950s were the Northeast and New York. You also had California being a hotbed, and the upper Midwest. It wasn't just fundamentalist Christians. There were a lot of people across the country who were upset. When you look at one of the earliest cases in which a comic book was adjudged to be obscene, in the early 1970s, where you have this formal case. The comic at issue was Zap Comics, and the court was in New York City, right? So when we have the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund arose out of a case in Illinois, the farthest you can get from the fundamentalist Christian South in the 1980s. And it involved a comic shop known as Friendly Frank's, and they were selling books that then were considered obscene by the local police and a local jury. Books like Heavy Metal, a graphic novel by Richard Corbin, whose work, of course, is now being archived, and he's a classic, a great artist. You had Dennis Kitchen's Omaha Cat Dancer. You had books that are now considered to be classics, sort of iconic works of independent publishing, underground art. They were the target in this comic shop. And again, the comic shop, you're seeing comic shops appear in malls, outdoor, indoor, near schools, near other things, and they're showing this stuff. And the police were starting to go into stores, and so they arrest the manager and convict him. He's actually found guilty in an Illinois court. And so the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund arose, and Dennis Kitchen was instrumental in this. And we got together a bunch of creators, like Jack Kirby, Will Eisner, others, to create a portfolio to raise money to fund this defense and appeal. And so they successfully got enough money to hire a lawyer who was a prominent First Amendment lawyer named Bert Joseph to challenge this conviction. And they got the conviction overturned. And what they realized was that this is not the first time this has happened. This will not be the last time this has happened. They had some money left over. They had a model for raising money from the community. It really was a grassroots organization. And they decided to create a nonprofit. I started as a nonprofit lawyer, and it's been amazing to read the history of this organization. Articles of incorporation and business plans may not excite a lot of people, but it's been incredible for me to read this history because from a nonprofit law perspective, it is an ideal organization. This is an organization that emerged out of the community to solve a community problem. And I think that has been the key to its, not just its success, but its ability to continue to be relevant for almost 40 years. I can tell you most of the nonprofits founded in 1986 aren't here. But the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is here, and I think it's stronger than ever. After the 19, I'm sorry, I got involved in the Friendly Frank's case, but it was a very, very important case for us. After that, we had a series of cases involving a number of books. The cases that I think most people are familiar with would be probably the Mike Diana Boiled Angel case, where we have an independent creator whose work is found to be obscene. There was, in fact, for a period of time, a restriction on his ability to create certain works because they were cartoon works, because he was seen as this dangerous purveyor of obscenity. You had a manga at the heart of a case where I was teaching at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, Keith's Comics, where you had a person employee at a comic shop arrested and convicted for selling manga that was deemed to be without any literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Hard to imagine today, but that's what was seen just 20 some years ago. Planet Comics was another one that was the target of another big case that we did. And then there are other cases like things like attempts to use trademark law to stop a parody, like in Starbucks. Kieran Dwyer, I believe, created this parody of Starbucks, which was actually making fun of not just of the logo and the company. And they attempted to use trademark law to stop it. And I found it really interesting when I took this gig. The very first case that I ended up dealing with was it happening again to somebody on the web, where they were using a logo, making a critique, and then bam, it was pulled off the web, and we were very happy to get that to negotiate to get that put back on. The repeat of history from the late 90s, early 2000s. So we've had a number of cases over the years. The most recently, the biggest one is no doubt the genderqueer case in Virginia Beach. That has become, not just because we won that case, which is incredibly important. If we had lost that case, I think there would have been cases like it all across the country. But it has become, the arguments in it have become key to defenses of all sorts of graphic novels nationwide. And I think in many ways, sort of the next wave of attacks has been a response to what we did there, trying to find ways around the arguments we made.
So you touched upon it earlier that comics typically are kind of this source of banning
Mhm.
for different mediums. I mean, why is it? And like I said, I know you talked about it earlier, but why do you feel like comics specifically continue to be the source? Because you mentioned how there were lawsuits on the Northeast, which someone right now would be surprised by that.
Mhm.
Um, do you think it's because of not just the topics, or do you also think that maybe part of it is just kind of like you had mentioned at the beginning? There's this ease of creativity to create it. Not that I'm saying making a comic is
Mhm.
easy, but do you think part of it's also just there's a way to kind of have more complex ideas faster created and then distributed? Like, why do you feel like it's consistently comics aside from just people attacking, specific morals or ideals or anything like that?
Mhm.
Like, is it limited to just that, or what do you
I
think?
think that
Is there a theme, or is it just kind of evolving over time that people just hate comics?
I think it um, I think it there's several different things happening. And I think you get these surges when a number of the the different waves converge. It becomes like the tsunami, right?
Mhm.
Um, you have all these vibrations and they intensify, and then bam, they try to wipe us out. And what we're undergoing now, I think in many ways is sort of a heightened version of what we've undergone before. There's some differences, but there's a lot of similarities. And I think one of them is exactly what you talked about. Again, to talk about McLuhan and the comics as a participatory medium, you don't have to. People feel like they when you're 6 years old, you don't feel like you have to go to like the IRO writers workshop to write a comic. Now, writing a comic, it has its own vocabulary, it has its own rhetoric. It isn't as easy as people think it is,
Mhm.
but just in terms of the basics of getting up, and you don't have to know, you don't have to learn language, which isn't really text language isn't really native to us as people. You're not born writing subject, verb, object, semicolons, complex sentences, but you
Mhm.
can get up and you can kind of draw a picture. That's sort of, you doodle and you draw a picture, it's sort of part of who we are. Um, and so it is participatory, it is engaging, it does attract kids. It attracts a lot of people around the world. And I think that there is this sense that, particularly people who feel like they're protecting some kind of tradition, some kind of society that never really existed, but they kind of wish it was, and feel it needs to be safeguarded. They see that kind of thing as a threat. But I think part of what makes comics particularly problematic is that they're iconic. Uh, they um, Comics have they convey a lot of information quickly. Um, they have this symbolic function in the community. I mean, you think about the way that sort of icons have been part of churches for years, for centuries, for millennia. Icons and pictures have been part of religious worship because they communicate a lot of information quickly. They're symbolic of the community itself, and not just beyond the information they convey. And you have these comics that are um, you see everything instantaneously. You have these images that represent the community to the community. It's what people see. It's part of the reason why people don't like to see certain graphic novels in libraries, because they almost view these comics as icons. You don't want to. They see they don't want the community to be represented by this image.
Mhm.
They don't bother. The text doesn't bother them so much because they don't read the text. They only interact with the text when somebody pulls it out and puts it in a guide and puts it on the web, where it becomes the text becomes an icon itself, right? It's like this sort of the text becomes almost an image, a symbol of the community, the same way that pictures, which are at the heart of the challenges were when they got this wave of censorship started. Which feeds into the next thing, sort of its iconic nature, is it's changing how we communicate. I think part of what's going on here is there is a fear that among some people that they're about to be left behind and that their kids are about to be left behind. They grew up learning that the way to succeed was to read Dickens, read Shakespeare, read, and read a lot of text, and learn how to write your letters. Right, if you're lucky, you can write some short stories and write some novels that get published and write in newspapers and make. Back in the days, you could make a lot of money writing for a magazine or writing for a newspaper, and they felt like somehow that was a key to success. And comics challenge that. Comics are a template for movies. They're a template for PowerPoints. They're a template for web video. They are a expressive medium in themselves. People tell all sorts of stories through images. So people are seeing literacy changing before their eyes. And I think part of the reason why they see that problematic is they don't understand it, but it also rightly threatens to supplant them. Right. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to be left behind. And the way to keep from being left behind is to keep progress from happening to begin with. And I want to get to another aspect where there's this convergence. One of the things I've talked about quite a bit is there's been some changes in what's pictured. All right. So, and where you can access it. If in novels, or in short stories, you could have descriptions of sex, descriptors of violence, descriptors of various racial issues. But again, there's a certain barrier to entry because you have to be able to read it, you have to be able to understand it. I think in some ways, the censorship of novels and pulps was also as much a reaction to the covers and the presence of the books as to whatever was inside. What comics did, and particularly comics now that are available to read everywhere, libraries, schools, on the web, is you had a lot of things pictured that you could see immediately that up until very, very, very recently weren't things that were pictured in a universally accessible medium. And more than that, they weren't something that was celebrated or seen as part of just everyday life in ordinary media. But in the past 20 years, we have had some number of changes in terms of how we understand sexuality, sexual expression. It's gone from something when I was in law school. When I was in law school, you could be thrown into prison. This is what the Supreme Court said 30 years ago. You could go to prison for being gay. And there was a case about this, Bowers against Hardwick, and the Supreme Court said, yep, if there's what they call it, an anti-sodomy law, constitutional, bang, you could do that. Around 20 years ago, the Supreme Court reverses that. It says, oh, overruled. Nope, that's protected. And they didn't just say it was protected as a right to privacy. They said it was equal protection, which gets us into the realm of what we call civil rights laws. And it gets us into the realm of something that is very public. It's something that's very American. They're part of the democratic order. It's not something that you keep behind closed doors the same way like contraception or a dirty book. It's something that's everywhere. And so we started talking about sexuality. We started talking about sexual identity, different forms of sexual expression, gender identity. But because pictures were the way we communicated now, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, really picking up in the past 5, all of a sudden, people didn't just say write about it in an essay that maybe 20 people read. They wrote it in graphic novels and you could see it. Mm-hmm. They wrote it in manga and you could see it. And this shocked a hell of a lot of people who weren't used to seeing this sort of thing in a picture, and seeing it in a picture they could get in their library, they could get at a store, a bookstore, Barnes and Noble, or a comic book shop, or even they could see it, and this is crucial in 2020, 2021, they could see these kinds of graphic novels in schools, and they're doing pictures of race, and they're doing pictures of people discussing their experience with sexual expression and gender identity. People weren't used to seeing this in pictures, which is why one of the first things I started noticing in 2020 was a rise of challenges where you've this funny thing happening where the text version of the book was allowed to be kept in the library, but the graphic novel adaptation was not.
Mm.
Just absolutely fascinating. Or you'd see books that were being prohibited, withdrawn from certain libraries or schools. And I could rattle off 20 text novels or nonfiction books that had the same type of material that's being knocked out from the graphic novel. They're targeting the graphic novel is particularly problematic. So these various things, the iconic nature of comics, the fact that it's this universal, now universally accessible medium, the fact that comics are a new form of literacy and the things they're picturing and in a way that's publicly accepted is changing. All of these things converged to create a tsunami of censorship challenges in the past 4 years.
No, I mean it's interesting that you're saying the imagery is really critical because it's now that I'm thinking about it, when I was in high school, whenever there was maybe a book that had a little more controversy, I feel like the cover was always a little more neutral.
Oh yeah.
So I wonder if that's
Mhm.
like a very particular move by the
Oh, definitely.
teacher to say, "Hey, we're going to read this book. It has these elements, but on the front, it's just a flower." Now, the
It's
story has all these different nuances to it, but the parents buy it, for their kids because it's required reading and it's a flower on it. Okay, here it's for your English class.
I think that is a very key insight. And I think that's part of the reason why publishers, and it's an adaptive behavior. If you look from a Darwinistic perspective, it was an adaptive behavior. When you had the early challenges, things like Ulysses or Lolita or something like that, Lady Chatterley's Lover. One of the ways that you deal with it is you put it in the proverbial plain brown wrapper, or
Mm-hmm.
beyond that, or the artistically designed cover,
Mm-hmm.
clever logo, clever typography,
Mm-hmm.
clever use of shading, something that didn't convey too much information about the stuff that was in, which is, I think, why, people didn't take science fiction seriously for a while, or quote, quote, pulp novels that are now being rediscovered as classics. A lot of the detective novels that are now in the Library of America, or books about lesbianism, or, the gay experience, is they had these covers on them that were pictures,
Mm-hmm.
and they were pictures that designed to grab attention, and they pictured images that you could represent things in the book. And I think in terms of people keeping those sorts of things off the shelves, I don't know that any of the people who were challenging them read them. I just think they saw the covers.
I was about to say, yeah,
Yeah.
judging a book by its cover, like that phrase
Judging a
says.
book by its cover. Yeah.
That's so
Uh,
interesting. So, you've talked about how a lot of these are more related to independent creators. In
mhm.
what ways has the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund sort of amplified the voices of underrepresented creators, especially those who kind of are facing challenges with wanting to tell stories? You talked about it with the genderqueer case, but are there any other cases that you all have worked on, and how is that sort of do you think there's been like a shift in people kind of feeling more comfortable, like, hey, there's at least an organization out there who's looking
Mhm.
out for a story?
Oh
I'm sure
yeah.
you all hear people when you go to different booths or
Oh,
conventions.
I hear stories from around the country. I get what I was doing right before this was looking at an email where somebody was sending me an update at another case. I have several others I have to respond to. Um, it is something that is going on around the country, and I'm glad. One of the positive effects of the genderqueer case was that people learned about us all around the country, and it
Mm-hmm.
was it was sort of it was interesting to me, to whether I'm speaking at Comic Cons, or people have been asking me to do guest speaking to libraries and schools and
Mm-hmm.
retailers and all this sort of stuff around the country, is to have people, coming up to you and thanking your organization for doing what you do. People you've never met, people from places whose names you've never known. They know that we're here to do this, and we're here to help. And we try to do whatever we can to connect people, locally, that can help them. We try to give advice on how to strategically, uh, increase acceptance, build acceptance for graphic novels and manga in your community. That has been tremendously rewarding. And it's particularly rewarding because of the types of challenges we're facing. So, for example, let me give you just a few that have come across the transom. And I try to protect, because I'm an attorney and I try to protect attorney-client privilege. but protecting independence is very, very important to me. And by the way, the a sort of symbol of it for me is the books that are behind me, which is the Russ Cochran editions of the EC library, the EC Comics line. They started publishing in the 1970s, and I started collecting them when I was a kid, when I was a teenager myself. Here you had this, this you'd say it now. It's this indie publisher who's innovating in science fiction, innovating in horror, innovating in other media, in suspense and doing civil rights stories. They do these what they call preachies and shock suspense stories, and others talking about racial discrimination. The first DC comic, one of the first DC comics I read, had the story in it called Judgment Day, which is about these robots of different colors, and they're being assessed for their progress. But the one robot is explaining how the one color lords it over the other color, and then you realize the astronaut is black at the end, and that's why he doesn't. He says this society still has a lot to go, and you realize, wow, it was this metaphor, this sort of symbol of American discrimination. A lot of powerful stuff. And so we're seeing these now, just not just one publisher, but everybody can self-publish. Everybody can get these deals with Image or something like that, or other publishers, and get their work all over the place. You can post it on the web. So taking that as an inspiration, I want to protect them, right? I don't want these creators, these publishers, these distributors to be shut down. So, and I don't want people who are trying to champion comics to be shut down either. So what do we have? We have a creator who publishes a comic, and then comic is distributed to a local shop. Somebody complains about the comic to the local police. The police say, oh, this comic concerns lesbianism. I don't think kids should be able to see lesbianism, even though it wasn't anything what we call graphic. It was like more contemporary style that wasn't a graphic in any way. And so we're going to go to the district attorney, and we're going to get this retailer arrested. Okay, so we have to work with a strategy, bring in local counsel, talk to the DA's office, and prevent the arrest and trial from happening. Doesn't hit the papers. Nobody knows about it. But, I view keeping somebody out of court as important as getting them to win in court. And that was real work. Or you have the classroom where the teacher loves manga and builds a manga collection for kids to read, and they could have a manga club. And the principal gets the idea that manga are all just people having gay sex or having sex with kids. And so all manga has to be eliminated. Bam. Not in the classroom, not in the library, no manga. Or you have another school where the principal says graphic novel, and this is the Virginia Beach case, same argument. Graphic novel means graphic sexual novel. So if it's a graphic novel, that means it's hiding sex somewhere in it. So out go the DCs, out go the Marvels, out go Captain Underpants, out go Diary of a Wimpy Kid, because it's a comic and it's a graphic novel, and therefore it has to be somehow sexual and hurting kids. You find, again, eliminating graphic novel versions of famous novels because they're somehow problematic, or you have the elimination of, say, Mouse because of certain images. We're also active in the legislative front. We're challenging several bills and even new laws around the country that try to make it easier to arrest people, to convict them, send them to jail for having comics or manga in schools, and comics and novels. Even though a lot of these statutes are drafted to encompass all types of literature for various constitutional reasons, but practical reasons that when they're arguing for these bills in their state legislatures, they are holding up graphic novels again and again and again as the problem. And so you can't provide explicit material to kids. And they define that very broadly in a way that's leading schools and libraries to withdraw from circulation books that have anything to do with gender identity, gender expression, sexual identity, or sexual expression, like whether you're LGBTQ in any way, the full gamut, anything to do with race, because they consider it to be controversial or somehow inflicting harm on children. These graphic novels, I mean, it's fascinating to see where you have a law, like in Missouri, laws in Missouri and Iowa targeting explicit things directed to kids or schools, and people are taking out New Kid, along with genderqueers, because there's this assumption that if it gets into these subjects, that it's somehow corrosive and problematic and graphic in a way we can't accept. We even have we're fighting a case in Texas where I'm actually going to be giving a deposition later this month, in 2 weeks, where there's an attempt to impose ratings on books. And again, graphic novels were a specific target of this legislation, an inspiration for this legislation, where they want to anything remotely sort of tangentially connected to sex. The distributors and publishers and creators are going to feel this pressure to put on whether the book is quote, quote, sexually explicit or sexually relevant, which, I think once you brand a book as sexually explicit, even if there's no, what you would call sort of intense sort of sex scenes in it, or is going to be the kiss of death in getting the books in schools and many libraries. We're finding something where, a lot of people in LGBTQ plus communities, a lot of people who write about race are affected. And it definitely affects them a lot because people find these problematic, because a lot of the rhetoric is new and they're not used to it, and I think they're seen as particularly dangerous. But there are ripple effects for the whole medium of itself, in itself, because there's this perception that if you are a librarian, if you're a teacher, if you're a bookseller, that graphic novels and manga could get you in trouble. So you want to minimize risk, and the best way to minimize it is not put them on the shelves in the first place. So that's what we're trying to prevent.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate that there's all these excuses, because when you think about it, there's so many different mediums out there where you have hyperviolence. I mean, there's plenty of kids right now playing Call of Duty, where it's a hyperviolent video game and parents don't have an issue with it, but because you have a story that may have, a little bit more deeper tones, or, something that maybe is a little more challenging that they're not comfortable with having to talk about, suddenly that's the issue. But you talked about...
I'll continue. I was going to say America's kind of weird in that respect, because there's a long history of talking about violence there's also a long history in other literature of talking about sex that we just basically removed from our books. I was a classicist before I did graduate level work in Greek and Latin, and then I went on and finished my PhD in religious history. And there are things in older books that we now consider the classics that most people don't realize are there. But in the West, in particularly, and especially in the United States, we stripped out talking about sex. It was problematic for a number of reasons, but we figured out how to talk about violence. We figured out that there were ways you could talk about violence that were tied to great themes of heroism and personal meaning, and the conquest of the West and all this sort of stuff. We talk overcoming crime or criminal as a symbol of fighting against an injustice of a more criminally problematic social order. We figured out how to talk about violence. We still haven't figured out how to depict sex. We don't know how to do it in a way, I think, that people, and I don't mean people don't know how to draw it. That's not what I'm talking about. To have depictions of sex in a way that everybody looks at it the same way they look at violence is sort of something they don't feel like they have to go to the police about, right? We just did not develop a vocabulary that everybody understood. We're in the process of doing that now. We've been really in a process of doing that over the past 20 years. But I just think it's unfortunate that comics have to pay the price for that.
So I know, are you still good on time, by the way?
Oh yeah, I'm still good on time. If you are,
Okay,
I am.
No, I am.
I didn't mean to talk too much, but I enjoy talking with you. So you ask great questions.
You're kind of covering a lot of my questions so far. So hold on, I'm gonna kind of skip ahead a bit. So
sure.
You've already kind of touched on self-publishers. For younger creators who may be hesitant to kind of express themselves freely due to censorship or legal repercussions, what advice would you give them in terms of, being able to tell a story that they feel is important, but at the same time, recognizing that, one, there may be challenges, and two, just there's also support through the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund that
Mhm.
potentially could be there if necessary. I know
Mhm.
you all probably have a very full plate, so I'm sure you all can't cover every case, but I'm sure you're doing your best to. But what
Mhm.
advice would you give to young creators who are kind of hesitant because they're like, well, I want to tell a story that's very personal. It may have elements that my school wouldn't be comfortable with, but I think it's important to talk about.
Mhm. Well, one of the things that we have, and we're very fortunate to have creators who are on our board, and a number of creators who have supported us through the years through donations of art, donations of money. Um, so a number of people have been able to speak to this on panels, and I think with United Voice, one of the things they emphasize is don't let this stop you. Don't censor yourself, because that's ultimately what people want, is they want to shut this down. They want to make you too afraid to communicate. And so the one thing I want to do to I want to encourage everybody to study how comics work, study how to communicate through visual media, this unique fusion of word and image, or even just visual storytelling if you don't use images. It's incredibly important, and I think that our future in many ways depends on creators feeling free to innovate, free to tell their stories, free to make the medium their own. I think that despite what people say, there are markets for everybody. I think it is possible, even if everybody isn't going to be the next, you know, Art Spiegelman,
Hmm.
not going to be the next Maya Kobe, or next Raina Telgemeier. You can find your voice, you can express yourself, you can find a market for your work, you can find a readership, and I think that's incredibly important for a life well lived. And then the next step is we'll think about sort of where do you want to publish, and what kind of distribution do you want? If you're thinking about getting your books in schools, you're going to be taking a look at what sort of books are going to get accepted into schools, how the sort of whole demographic classification works in publishing. What is a young adult? What is a middle reader? What is, all these different things, these categories that have emerged. And think about what you can say for whom, or what you can depict for whom, how you can depict it. Just like the people who worked under the Comics Code, which was adopted after the Great Comics Scare, and was a means of self-regulating the industry, they became very clever in how they took sexual and mature themes, and expressed them in a way that everything at two levels. You know, and that actually carried over even to the Batman TV show, which in many ways some of the dirtiest TV of the 1960s. You just had to be adult to see what was really going on there, even though it looked to my 8-year-old and 4-year-old and 3-year-old eye as this is just a man fighting for good.
Hmm.
Adults. I'm older and I'm going, oh my God, how did they get it on TV?
Yeah.
Just because it's wild. I'm impressed by their skill. Um, part of what you do, and that's, I think, is part of the genius of people like Maya and Reina and others, is that they can they can publish things that are really cutting edge.
Hmm.
And even though they get challenged, they also survive those challenges more often than not in schools,
Hmm.
because people realize there's really something significant there, literary, artistic. Talks about impressing political issues. Even Maya goes on a long scientific discussion of the science of gender identity. There's stuff there. Maya figured out how to do it. Raina's figured out how to do it. A lot of people have figured out how to use this medium in a way that communicates very sophisticated, cutting edge, and personal ideas and stories, while also finding a marketplace and being able to survive most of the challenges. Um, and even when they don't survive the challenges in a particular district, there are enough people who are outraged at a book of such quality being challenged or even being banned, that it inspires other people to buy the work or adopt it in their school. So it involves an artist has always been on the cutting edge of the society. An artist sees the future and the present more clearly than most people who are just walking through life invisible to what they see. That's always deemed to be a threat to a lot of people. And artists have a long legacy of being able to um, speak out and be purely different and sort of norm shattering, stereotype shattering, convention shattering. They also have a tremendous ability to use the limitations in the society in which they're drawing and writing to transcend them. And so I don't I I really sympathize with the creator. I'm not saying this all very easy, and I am hurt by the people who, the questions I get. How can I advertise this? Will this? I'm hurt by the stories I get from creators who wrote something and then wrote a graphic novel and was making it up the chain, and then a book challenge happens of some other book, and their graphic novel is similar enough that it gets dropped and
Mhm.
doesn't ever see the light of day. I'm not saying that pain doesn't happen. It happens, and we're fighting to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Um, but I think it is possible to rise above it. I think it is possible to find a market. I think it's possible for us to, like we've done multiple times before, we start thinking about alternative channels of distribution and ways we can escape the limitations. It's incredibly important now because so many people communicate not on printed paper, but on the web.
Mhm.
And I I think one of my biggest priorities right now, but also an area where I'm finding our biggest challenges is exactly is dealing with terms and conditions and also laws applicable to distribution on the web because there's a lot of pressure on private platforms, countries around the world to eliminate sexual content, even if it's artistic, even if it's a memoir, to eliminate content that discusses the realities of race, to eliminate content that has any political signification. I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about soon more is something that happened to us. We had a signing with Raina Telgemeier in San Diego Comic Con. Book drama has been challenged around the country because of a scene where I don't want to do spoilers, but let's just say it gets into questions of gender identity and dress and who can wear what. Um, because I think for many, there are people who are shocked to know that if you have the theater community of all places, is places where notions of gender and sexuality are somewhat more fluid than
Mhm.
1950s Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver America. Um, but so we really wanted to honor that book, and we published a post on Facebook promoting the signing, and Facebook freezes it. We're
Mhm.
trying to boost it so we could get more circulation in our community. Hey, find out about this thing. We couldn't boost it because we get this thing saying this post violates our terms and conditions.
Mhm.
And I dug further, and I got to talk to people about this because I said I would. I dug further, and they said that this is an issue. Gender identity, gender expression, dress norms was an issue that was politically controversial. It is something that we're discussing in elections, and therefore it's not something we can have on Facebook, which is absolutely shocking because now, anybody who's doing a memoir on talking about gender identity, sexuality, you don't even have to show nudity.
Mhm.
You
Just
could
the
just
topic itself is now
the
controversial.
topic itself is now controversial and is going to be bounced from Facebook, which is you can only talk like I can only talk about drama if I don't talk about any drama,
Mhm.
um, and I can't really talk about what is in the book if I want to promote the book online, which is, for what we do, this perfect symbol of what's going on. So, to young creators, I want to encourage them. I want to encourage them to fight. I want to encourage them to talk to us and help them navigate these waters. I think it's possible to do, but I recognize that it's not always easy and that we're fighting a fight. Look, I like to say, and this is probably the biggest encouragement I've given to librarians and creators who the feedback I've gotten is they really appreciate it. And I've seen other organizations that start to use it, which is also very gratifying, is we've already won. Um, Part of the reason why the reaction has been so fierce, it's a reflection of the impact that comics are having on our society. There's this recognition that society is changing. But I think what creators feel, I think what we recognize is that the reality is that society's already changed. You're not
Mm-hmm.
putting the impact of, you're not going to put comics in a bottle. They're not going to go away. They're
Mm-hmm.
going to be here forever. And I think just as the 1950s comic scare and the comics code gave way to the boom in independent comics, and EC becomes a template for popular entertainment, independent
Mm-hmm.
comics become a template for modern entertainment. Now everything that's being challenged is going to be so boring and mainstream in the 1950s. It's not funny. And just as now you can have kids look at the stuff from the cutting edge comics of the 50s and say it's old hat, and the cutting edge comics from the 80s and 90s, why do people find that dangerous? 30 years from now, they're going to be thinking about, why were people challenging genderqueer? Why were people challenging drama and mouse? Yeah, those are the classics. Those are normal. Let's do let's do something even more interesting. Let's do something even more
Mm-hmm.
challenging and communicate in even more creative ways. That's just the nature of media. And it's the wonderful thing about being a creator or being connected to protecting the comic arts, is that you're part of that process. You're doing the cutting edge stuff now that's going to become mainstream in the future. It's already won. And I think we can go forward in the confidence that we fought that battle. It's like, I just reread Lord of the Rings, and the Ring of Power has already been melted. We're in the phase of the scouring of the Shire at this point. They just don't know
Mm-hmm. So, you talk about how hopefully, in the future, people are looking at the cases now and thinking, why are they,
it.
why were they even challenged to begin with? And this is kind of a twofold question. What sort of threats do you all anticipate in the future? And then what kind of programs are you all kind of having as part of your nonprofit to kind of help with educating, to kind of prepare creators for what potentially could happen, or also just educate creators for what's happening now?
Mhm. Let's go through several different levels. I don't think the challenges at a local level are going away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in a way, we're kind of in a, if Trump wins, a lot of people are going to be feel empowered to fight. If Harris wins, I think that a lot of people are going to see because she's publicly opposed to these book bans, they're going to see this as even more problematic and feel even more empowered to fight. So I feel like these challenges are going to go on for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so if you're protecting, if you want to champion the comic arts in your local community, I think it's important to see that the whole graphic sexual novel thing is BS. That let's get people to understand how graphic novels work, how manga works, how uh, people can express themselves through it, how these media are relevant to all of life now, even if you've never become a professional comics creator or you even just read them as an avocation. They're just part of life. And the more we can normalize comics and communication through comics and reading comics, I think the more protected the medium will be. I think we are facing a particular challenge now in terms of the pressure to arrest people for distributing certain works. What the other side has figured out is you don't actually have to arrest anybody, and the
Mm-hmm.
laws don't have to be able to survive a constitutional challenge. It's enough that the bills are being introduced, that laws are being passed, and even if they do get struck down in court, it's been looming over people for years, and they want to manage risk. And so the schools aren't going to get these books in. There's not going to be sort of institution building in favor of having comic arts as part of the curriculum or part of your library, or in retail stores to the same degree, or in certain types of books in retail stores to the same degree, because people are afraid that they're going to be arrested, or
Mm-hmm.
even if they would win the case, nobody wants to spend $200,000. And even if I'm giving pro bono legal advice and representing somebody in court pro bono, there are other charges that come along the way. You have to have local counsel, and not everybody does pro bono work. It's expensive, it's harrowing, it's awful process. Court is torture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that challenge is out there, and figuring out a way to make people less afraid of these challenges and to show that they really are paper tiger. And the next one is algorithms. Uh, we've talked about AI and how right now in the comics community, we're concerned about AI just hoovering up comics and then being
Mm-hmm.
as a source for being essentially being copied and used in other people's work without credit or compensation. But equally problematic is basically through metadata or scanning books themselves, anything with a particular topic, anything with a picture scene or a panel, particular image, automatically gets disqualified from distribution or publication or adoption in the classroom, inclusion in the library. That's a problem. That's a threat. Posting on the web, it's something that could get your bank account frozen. It could certainly something that could get you kicked off crowdfunding platforms. It's something that could get your social media account, even your email stripped. I mean, the things that could happen to people is absolutely stunning. Suppose you're using your Gmail, Google Drive to store your comics that someone has challenged and they file a bunch of stuff on you publicly, and Google decides that, oh my God, you're using Google Drive to store pornography, even if it's not. Who do you appeal to? How do you get it back? Google has hundreds of thousands of employees, and yet when you're fighting these things, you don't seem to be able to reach any of them. You just get in this loop. Same with Facebook. It's this faceless monolith when it comes to rescuing something from censorship. So those are big challenges now. Our work is not going away. Now, do I think we can win? Yes, but it is going to require everybody who loves comics to join with us in the fight. If you can code, if you know how to work these algorithms, to revise them, to change what's being done, if you love comics, you can just give a session at your local library on the comics you've read and loved and what they mean to you. You can do things on comics history and what you can learn from comics history. If you're a lawyer, you can give things on, help people to understand intellectual property in comics and how you can make money from drawing your comics over time and protect your rights in comics. There's all sorts of things that you can do to help normalize comics and fight this attempt to shut them down.
So I know you all are, very busy, and you talk about how people can kind of get involved with, the fight. Let's talk about kind of the community sort of participating in that. I know you all attend conventions, so people can kind of talk with you there, but obviously the work that you all are doing is very important. And like I said, I do feel like for a lot of comic book readers, I think the recognition that there are threats of bans is very much understood, but I think the gravity of it, unfortunately, isn't fully recognized. Mostly because for a lot of comic book fans, they're reading their story, they're picking it up at a comic book shop, and then they're kind of just moving on from there. But like you said, there's challenges is popping up everywhere. So, for anybody listening to this in the future or anybody kind of reading the write-up, how can they kind of further get involved with your organization to be supportive so that, you all can continue to do what you do? What ways can people kind of really make that effort?
Several different ways. And, obviously, we're a nonprofit organization. Donations are truly appreciated. And when we've started auctions again, and we're going to be revamping our book sales programs and things like that. Every book
you have a cool membership, right?
Yeah, in fact, our new membership card is coming out, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
It's at the printers right now, and we're going to be.
I need to sign up for that. Actually, I saw that on the website before we talked, and I was like, I want a membership card. That sounds cool.
There are people who collect them. It's amazing.
Yeah, but there's a membership.
Yeah, we're already planning the one for next year, so it's really good stuff. So the membership is fantastic. Our auctions and stuff at conventions, we're going to be doing some stuff online. But in addition to that, I think it's very important to people to feel connected in the work. If they want to be part of it beyond donations and purchases and things, there are ways to do that. And we're in the process of revamping a lot of that, because I have a vision of what we can do to get people even more involved than they have been in the past. So we've been building a volunteer database. We have people who want to write articles for us, lawyers who want to help us, paralegals, people who want to help with web design. And we're going to have a meeting with some people on that in the next few weeks to revamp our technological infrastructure so that we can make it more participatory, engaging, and if people have ways they can actually be part of the CBLDF online and explain why it's important to them to get more regular news about cases. We're reviving our outreach. It's part of the reason why membership is going to be so cool, is that We're reviving our newsletter programs. You get regular case updates and things like that, and we'll talk about the sort of things that are happening. Volunteering is incredibly important, and even if you don't, and so we're going to be coordinating volunteers around the country. That I think is going to help mobilize. But even if you are a little, shy about volunteering for an organization, which don't be, because it's not a huge time commitment, and we just your involvement in this is even just saying thank you and how can I help is important to us. It's incredibly encouraging. But there are little things you can do in your community. Support your local comics retailer, or support whoever you're buying comics from online. Continue to buy comics, continue to buy web comics, support people on Kickstarter who do work that might be the target of bans, or just a sort of an independent voice that we don't hear enough about. Things that you can do, what you're doing here with pages and panels, doing stuff on the web, doing stuff on social media, enlightening people on why the comic arts matter, what their history is, working with librarians and teachers. You can donate comics locally. I've donated comics to hospitals. I've donated comics to schools. Part of the reason I've had to buy several graphic novels over and over again of these is I read them, limited space. They go to some place that wants them, and then I have to buy them again when I want to reread them, and then they go to another place.
Yeah, I was about to say, libraries are a great way to clear out some of your short boxes. I had like
exactly
6 short boxes, and some of them I was like, I knew I wasn't going to read them again. And I'm like, I don't want to get rid of them, so I took them to my library, and they were excited about it. They're like, "Yep, this is going to be all over the city." So I was like, "Perfect. Somebody gets to read it."
Somebody gets to read it. And one of the things I've loved is we're seeing local Comic Cons in their local libraries, or local Comic Cons in some old lodge building or something, or at the local mall. People get together and they sell books, and they also have panels, which I absolutely love. We've had people, ask us to do things. I can't go all around the country. One of the things we want to do with volunteers is have people able to represent us as conventions around the country. So, it saves on money, it saves on, jet fuel.
Yeah. I was about to say, I'm based out of Houston, and I don't think I've seen the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund there, but I mean, I also feel like Houston's Comic-Con doesn't have like the biggest comic presence. It's more like pop culture, but again, it's the 4th largest city in the United States. You really should have a presence. So I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, and like Texas is one of those states where anti-drag laws have been an issue. Well, what gets caught up in anti-drag laws? Cosplay. Gender fluid cosplay gets caught up in anti-drag laws. And so, heck, if there are any Houston lawyers, I got to look over our volunteer list, but if there are any Houston lawyers who want to talk about CBLDF at the Houston Comic-Con, get in touch. Let's see what we can make happen. Want to have a Zoom session with me or with somebody else at the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, get in touch. We'll see if we can make that happen. I've done that with people around the country for local libraries. In fact, I just have my schedule today is my email box, where I'm speaking to a regional group of librarians about this issue and what they can do to promote graphic novels in their community, and through positive discussions of graphic novels, prevent and counter book challenges. One of the things that have helped revolutionize in terms of the strategy is there's been so much focus on speaking out in school board meetings and libraries, or going to the police or whatever to fight these things. Many people don't want to do public speaking. They don't want to go on YouTube. They don't want to get caught up in this. But you can have conversations. I say this isn't just for activists. Everybody from pastors to plumbers. Everybody loves comics. Everybody loves graphic novels. Have these conversations among yourselves. Have these conversations with people in city council. Have these conversations with decision makers. And some of the comics that we've been able to save have come about where the decisions were made even before the meeting occurred, just through private conversations. Talking to the principal, talking to the superintendent, say, hey, don't do this because this matters to my kid. This matters to the future. This is why you don't want to discourage people from reading these books or expressing themselves through these books. This makes a difference. And I think you can be part of an incredibly important cultural shift. You can be a part. Everybody who listens to this interview everybody who is engaged with pages and panels every time you make a video, every time you put up an audio. Everybody who's part of your community can make a difference in their local community that can have ripple effects through the country at large. Because once everybody knows what you're trying to convey here at Pages and Panels, and I got that right? I hope I
did. Yeah, thank you.
I realize I'm sitting here talking. I want to make sure I want to make sure I don't get it wrong.
No, I appreciate that.
But everybody who listens to this, is the more people you can get to appreciate what you're trying to do, the more people there will be when somebody raises a challenge. Says graphic novels are sex, they're nothing but sex, and if they do talk about sex, it's all horrible and pornography and whatever. Nah, if you have a whole community that's schooled in this, that'll be laughed out of the building, or it'll just get a yawn because nobody will take it seriously, because they know comics and they know graphic novels and they know the visual vocabulary, even when it talks about sex and race, and they know what's really going on in these books, and they know why these books matter, and they know who it matters to. So your community is vital, and it's part of the reason I'm so glad to be on this podcast. It's this is how we're going to win. This is how we're going to make the victory. I think that's already secured for us. This is how we're going to make it a reality, and it's going to be faster than it would have been if we just sort of let these other forces continue to roll and shut us down.
Amazing. Well, Jeff, thank you so much. This has honestly been incredibly inspirational, and it's so great to learn more about the organization. And like I said, I will definitely be encouraging any followers of Pages and Panels to check you all out, to get involved in any way that they can, because I mean it's so important, because again, this topic, I feel like I've said it before, but I think a lot of comic book readers don't really think about it, and once you open that floodgate of banning, I mean, where does it end? Where does your where does your indie comic suddenly getting banned to even a Spider-Man comic or a Batman
right
comic?
exactly
Like you're
which
big
we've
too.
seen.
Yeah, you have all these different stories that are beloved and characters that are important and personal to a lot of readers. So thank you for taking time to talk with me. This was amazing.
Thank you.
And I can't wait to, unfortunately, I know you have more cases, unfortunately, but I can't wait to hear all the wins that you all are going to have. And I will definitely be putting links in this interview for anybody watching, for your website, ways to get involved, all that. So Jeff, thank you so much again for taking time to talk with me. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody who's listening to this, and all of your community. Just thanks for doing what you do.
Thank you so much again. Take care.
All right, thanks.